The story of the Soviet Union is a tale of revolution, ambition, ideology, and power. From its birth in the ashes of Imperial Russia to its rise as a global superpower, and finally to its collapse in the early 1990s. This documentary will take you on a journey through the key moments, figures, and struggles that shaped one of the most influential empires in modern history. This is the rise and fall of the Soviet Union. At the turn of the 20th century, Russia was an empire in crisis. Ruled by Tsar Nicholas II, the Romanov dynasty faced growing unrest from the working class and peasantry. The defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, the tragedy of Bloody Sunday, and the devastating losses of World War I pushed the nation to its breaking point. In 1917, revolution finally erupted. First, in February, the Tsar abdicated and a provisional government took control. But it was the October Revolution, led by Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks, that truly changed history. They promised peace, land, and bread to the suffering people. The Bolsheviks seized power, storming the Winter Palace and declaring a new socialist state. What followed was a brutal civil war between the Red Army of the Bolsheviks and the White forces loyal to the old regime. By 1922, the Bolsheviks emerged victorious. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, was officially formed. A new era had begun, built on Marxist-Leninist ideology and a desire to reshape the world. After Lenin's death in 1924, a power struggle emerged within the Communist Party. Joseph Stalin outmaneuvered his rivals, and by the late 1920s, he had consolidated absolute control. Stalin launched a massive transformation of the Soviet economy through forced collectivization and five-year plans. Millions of peasants were forced off their land into collective farms, leading to widespread famine, especially in Ukraine, where millions died in what became known as the Holodomor. Industrialization surged as factories and infrastructure projects rapidly expanded. But this progress came at a devastating human cost. Stalin's regime ruled through terror, purges, and propaganda. The Great Purge of the 1930s saw millions executed or sent to gulags in remote labor camps. Despite the repression, the USSR emerged as a major industrial power. In 1939, Stalin signed a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany. But in 1941, Hitler broke the pact and launched Operation Barbarossa. The Soviet Union was plunged into World War II, fighting some of the bloodiest battles in human history. The Red Army turned the tide at Stalingrad and pushed westward, eventually capturing Berlin in 1945. The USSR emerged from the war victorious, but deeply scarred. It had become a global superpower, ready to shape the new world order. After World War II, The Soviet Union stood as one of two global superpowers. The other was the United States, and the world quickly divided into two opposing blocs. The Cold War had begun. The USSR expanded its influence over Eastern Europe, establishing communist regimes in Poland, East Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and others. This Eastern Bloc was tightly controlled under the leadership of Moscow. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb, ending America's nuclear monopoly. An arms race began, with both sides stockpiling nuclear weapons. To counter NATO, the Soviets formed the Warsaw Pact in 1955. In 1957, the USSR shocked the world by launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite into space. The space race symbolized the broader technological and ideological rivalry between East and West. Under Nikita Khrushchev, the USSR experienced some liberalization, known as the thaw, but tensions remained high. The KGB maintained strict surveillance and censorship. Despite its internal repression, the Soviet Union supported revolutionary movements worldwide, from Asia to Africa to Latin America. By the 1970s, the USSR had reached the peak of its power, rivaling the United States in military strength and global influence. Yet, beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form in the Soviet system. By the late 1970s, the Soviet economy was stagnating. Heavy industries were outdated and inefficient. Central planning led to shortages, poor quality goods, and lack of innovation. Agriculture lagged behind, forcing the USSR to import grain. Meanwhile, military spending drained resources from civilian needs. The war in Afghanistan, beginning in 1979, became a costly and unpopular conflict, often compared to America's Vietnam. Under Leonid Brezhnev, the system became more corrupt and bureaucratic. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power with a bold agenda of reform. He introduced glasnost, meaning openness, and perestroika, meaning restructuring. These policies aimed to make the USSR more transparent and economically flexible. However, they also unleashed forces that Gorbachev could not control. Glasnost revealed the extent of past repression, environmental disasters, and economic failure. The Chernobyl nuclear accident in 1986 further damaged trust in the government. Nationalist movements gained momentum in the republics. By 1990, the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia were demanding independence. The Eastern Bloc began to collapse as revolutions overthrew communist regimes in Poland, Hungary, East Germany, and beyond. In 1991, a failed coup by hardliners in Moscow accelerated the unraveling. By December 1991, the Soviet Union was officially dissolved. 15 independent nations emerged from its ashes, with Russia as the largest successor state. The red flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. After nearly 70 years, the Soviet experiment had ended. The collapse of the Soviet Union reshaped the global order. It marked the end of the Cold War and left the United States as the sole superpower. Former Soviet republics faced economic turmoil, political instability, and identity crises. In Russia, the 1990s brought privatization, hyperinflation, and rising oligarch power. The transition from communism to capitalism was chaotic and painful for many citizens. Nuclear weapons spread among former republics, prompting global concern. The West hailed the end of the USSR as a victory for democracy and free markets. However, nostalgia for Soviet stability and power remains strong among some populations. In foreign policy, Russia, under Vladimir Putin, has sought to reassert influence over its neighbors. Conflicts in Georgia, Crimea, and Ukraine are part of this post-Soviet legacy. The ideological struggle between authoritarianism and liberal democracy continues in new forms. Culturally, the Soviet Union left behind a deep legacy in science, literature, space exploration, and art. From Sputnik to Gagarin, from Tolstoy to Tarkovsky, Soviet influence shaped a century. The memory of the USSR remains controversial, seen as both a totalitarian nightmare and a source of national pride. Its rise and fall offer lasting lessons about power, ideology, human rights, and the cost of empire. In history books, classrooms, and political debates, the Soviet Union lives on as one of the 20th century's most defining stories.